Cartoons from the Golden Age weren't all happy mice, singing princesses, and wisecracking rabbits. Hidden in the vaults are shorts and series so bizarre, you'll wonder how they ever made it to the screen. These weren't polished fairy tales. They were experiments that sometimes looked more like fever dreams than children's entertainment. Have you ever seen a cartoon that made you laugh 1 second and cringe the next? Well, you're about to. The Sunshine Makers, 1935. This wasn't just a cartoon. It was a smiling nightmare, dressed in bright colors. Produced by Van Buren Studios, The Sunshine Makers looks cheerful on the surface. But watch it closely, and it feels more like a warning than a comedy. The short begins in a land of red gnomes, creatures with wide eyes and permanent grins, who live in a world of endless sunshine. They bottle the light, march in unison, and sing in squeaky voices. At first, you think it's just harmless fun. Then, the story turns. Their enemies, the blue goblins, live in darkness and enjoy being gloomy. They want nothing to do with forced cheer. But the gnomes don't take no for an answer. They march like an army and throw bottles of sunshine at the goblins, blasting them into forced smiles. It's strange because the goblins aren't really villains. They're just different. Yet the short insists they must be converted into grinning, dancing creatures. The visuals are unforgettable. Smiling faces stretch too wide. Laughter is repeated in eerie loops, and the goblins writhe as the bottled light forces them to change. It's supposed to be a happy ending, but it feels oddly sinister. Why? Because it suggests happiness isn't a choice, it's a demand. Looking back, The Sunshine Makers is one of those early shorts that shows how strange Golden Age animation could get when studios experimented without rules. It's remembered today less as a light-hearted cartoon and more as one of the creepiest, cheerful films of the 1930s. Bottles, 1936. What starts out cute takes a hard left into nightmare territory. Bottles, a Warner Brothers Merry Melodies short, begins with a pharmacist falling asleep in his shop. That's when the fun starts, or so you think. Every bottle in the store comes to life. Baby bottles cry like real infants, medicine bottles dance, and liquor bottles wobble around like tipsy party guests. It's whimsical at first, the kind of surreal comedy people expected from cartoons in the 1930s. But then comes the poison bottle. With a skull-shaped cap and a maniacal laugh, it opens up and unleashes chaos. Skeletons crawl out, witches swirl around the screen, and monsters chase the poor pharmacist through a nightmare pharmacy that's more horror show than comedy. The sequence is so intense that it feels like it belongs in a spooky short rather than a light-hearted one. What makes Bottles stand out is how it plays with the idea of ordinary objects turning into something terrifying. Kids in the audience probably laughed nervously, while adults might have recognized the darker undertones. After all, this was during the Great Depression, when people were already anxious. A cartoon where everyday medicine turns deadly would have felt unsettling in ways that went beyond slapstick. The short is still remembered for its wild animation and sudden tonal shift. It's one of those forgotten cartoons that reminds you the Golden Age wasn't afraid to scare its audience. What starts as a shop full of dancing bottles ends as a parade of frightening visions, leaving you with an ending that feels anything but comfortable. It's a Greek Life, 1936. Imagine mixing Greek mythology with slapstick comedy, and you've got It's a Greek Life. Produced by Van Buren Studios, this cartoon doesn't take the gods seriously at all. Instead, it turns them into the butt of the joke. The story follows a clumsy centaur who is tasked with repairing the flying sandals of Mercury, the messenger god. You can already guess this won't go well. Rather than fixing them, the centaur decides to try the sandals on himself. Once strapped in, he shoots into the sky completely out of control. What follows is pure chaos. He crashes into the clouds, collides with other gods, and causes general mayhem across Mount Olympus. The soundtrack doesn't help. It's packed with zany sound effects that make the entire thing feel like a Three Stooges sketch instead of mythology. The animation is frantic and full of squash and stretch movement, but nowhere near the polish of Disney or Fleischer Studios. Characters wobble, bend, and stretch in strange ways, giving the cartoon a raw and experimental vibe. What really makes it strange is the disconnect between subject and style. You'd expect gods and heroes to be majestic. Instead, they're reduced to slapstick buffoons. In its own way, It's a Greek Life captures the experimental spirit of the Golden Age. Studios were willing to twist even ancient mythology into bizarre comedy. Today, it feels like a weird time capsule, an irreverent take on stories usually treated with respect. Watching it now, you might laugh, but you'll also shake your head wondering who thought this was a good idea. A Swiss Trick, 1931. This isn't the Tom and Jerry you know. Long before the famous cat and mouse duo, Van Buren Studios had its own pair of characters also called Tom and Jerry, only these were two human men. And their adventures were strange, to say the least. A Swiss Trick takes them to the snowy Alps, where things quickly spiral into surreal territory. It begins with their train breaking down in the mountains. A St. Bernard dog tries to help, but instead, chaos unfolds. Tom and Jerry end up being chased by goats, slipping down icy cliffs, and running into avalanches. The strangest moment comes when they gorge themselves on Swiss cheese. They eat so much of it that their bodies literally sprout holes. By the end, mice mistake them for cheese and chase them across the screen. The animation style makes everything even weirder. Characters stretch and bend like rubber, often defying physics in ways that don't feel intentional, but rather like mistakes. The rough drawing style, combined with the surreal story, makes the short feel more like an unhinged dream than a cartoon. Looking back, A Swiss Trick shows how experimental and sometimes careless Golden Age cartoons could be. It's one of those oddities that proves not every early animated series had the charm or polish of Disney or Warner Brothers. Instead, it leaves you laughing awkwardly and wondering why human characters would literally turn into cheese. It's unsettling, ridiculous, and unforgettable all at once. Willy Whopper in Hell's Fire, 1934. When you think of kids' cartoons, you probably don't think of hell. But that's exactly where Ub Iwerks sent his character Willy Whopper in the short Hell's Fire. This bizarre cartoon begins with Willy throwing a rock into a volcano. That rock hits none other than the devil on the head. And just like that, Willy and his dog are dragged down into the underworld. Now, you'd expect hell to be terrifying, full of torment and punishment. Instead, it looks more like a carnival. Willy runs into historical figures like Napoleon and Cleopatra, who are hanging out as if the underworld is some kind of party. Demons run around causing mischief, and the devil himself seems more annoyed than scary. The animation is lively, full of strange transformations and sight gags. At one point, prohibition itself is personified and force-fed drinks by demons. A surreal sequence that feels like political satire hidden inside a children's cartoon. Watching it now, it's hard to believe this was marketed to kids at all. What makes Hell's Fire so strange is the way it takes a place usually depicted as frightening and turns it into a slapstick playground. Instead of punishment, it's chaos. Instead of horror, it's parody. The result is a cartoon that feels bizarrely upbeat given the setting. It's one of those Golden Age oddities that leaves you stunned, not because it's scary, but because it's so wildly inappropriate for its supposed audience. The Little Match Girl, 1937. This wasn't slapstick. This was heartbreak. Released by Disney as part of the Silly Symphonies series, The Little Match Girl was unlike anything else in theaters at the time. Instead of funny animals or comic pratfalls, it told a somber tale of a poor girl wandering through snowy streets with nothing but a bundle of matches. No talking animals, no jokes, no happy ending. Just sorrow. The story unfolds as she strikes each match to keep warm. With every flame, she sees a vision of comfort, a warm fire, a rich holiday feast, or a decorated Christmas tree glowing in the night. But each match burns out, and she's left shivering in the snow. The final scene shows her lighting her last match and seeing the vision of her grandmother, before she closes her eyes forever. Disney had been known for pushing emotional storytelling, but this was a leap into territory that most audiences weren't prepared for. The short is beautifully animated, almost painterly in style, but the sadness is unrelenting. Children left theaters in tears. Adults wondered why a cartoon would end this way. It clashed completely with the idea of cartoons as funny papers come to life. Looking back, The Little Match Girl is one of the most daring examples of Golden Age animation. It didn't flinch from tragedy. It showed that animation could be more than laughter. It could be pure pathos. Today, it stands as both a haunting gem and a reminder that not every cartoon was designed to leave you smiling. Sometimes, they wanted to make you cry. Dinner Time, 1928. Before Disney's Steamboat Willie revolutionized sound and animation, there was Dinner Time. Released by Paul Terry and the Van Buren Studio, this short beat Disney to the finish line by a single month. But instead of being remembered as a groundbreaking milestone, it's remembered as chaotic. The plot is barely there. A farmer is preparing dinner when a horde of dogs shows up, determined to steal his food. What follows is a noisy free-for-all. The dogs bark, growl, and yelp while the farmer shouts and swings at them. The animation jerks and stutters. The sound effects are loud and mismatched, often coming half a second too late. Rather than synchronized sound feeling magical, it feels like nails on a chalkboard. At the time, audiences were fascinated simply because the cartoon talked back. Hearing dogs bark and humans shout on screen was a novelty. But even then, critics noted how unpleasant it was compared to the cleaner synchronization Disney pulled off weeks later. That's why Steamboat Willie became history, and Dinner Time became a footnote. Still, Dinner Time deserves its spot on this list, because of just how odd it feels today. The crude sound, the rough animation, the screeching chaos. It's like watching someone experiment without instructions. It's not entertaining so much as fascinating, a reminder that early animators were stumbling into the future, sometimes gracefully, sometimes clumsily. And in this case, very clumsily. Clutch Cargo, 1959-60. If you've ever wondered what happens when budget cuts go too far, Clutch Cargo is your answer. Created by Cambria Studios, this syndicated TV show was an adventure cartoon that tried to tell thrilling stories of a square-jawed pilot and his young sidekick. On paper, it sounds like standard Saturday morning fare. But in execution, it turned into one of the most unsettling experiments in animation history. To save money, the studio used a technique called synchrovox. Instead of animating mouth movements, they filmed real human mouths and superimposed them onto still cartoon faces. The result? Frozen drawings with eerily realistic lips moving in unnatural ways. Watching it feels like stepping into the uncanny valley. It's not quite horror, but it's certainly not comfortable either. The stories themselves were straight adventure serials. Clutch would fly around the world, battle villains, and solve mysteries. But none of that mattered. Viewers couldn't look away from those strange, disembodied mouths plastered onto stiff characters. The creepiness overshadowed everything else. Kids of the era tuned in because it was different. Critics, however, dismissed it as lazy and disturbing. And yet somehow, it ran for 26 episodes and has remained a cult curiosity ever since. Clutch Cargo proves that sometimes the strangest ideas come not from imagination, but from desperation. The creators wanted to save money, but instead, they created one of the weirdest visuals in cartoon history. Once you've seen it, you'll never forget it. Luno the White Stallion, 1960. Golden Age cartoons usually gave kids cheerful animals and slapstick gags. Luno the White Stallion decided to do something else entirely. Produced by Terry Toons, Luno was a magical flying horse who could become invisible, grant wishes, and take children on adventures. Sounds whimsical, right? But here's the twist. These adventures were often surprisingly heavy. Instead of silly antics, Luno's stories dealt with children facing serious challenges. Orphans longing for families, kids caught in disasters, children struggling with loneliness. Luno wasn't just there for laughs. He was there to rescue them from real pain. That tone set it apart from nearly everything else on TV. Visually, the show looked like typical Terry Toons. Simple designs, limited animation, and bold colors. But the content felt mismatched. A winged horse soaring through the skies should have been pure fantasy. Yet Luno was often portrayed as a savior in deeply emotional scenarios. One episode might feature him helping a child trapped in danger. Another could show him comforting someone who felt abandoned. The result was a show that felt strangely grown up, even when disguised as a Saturday morning cartoon. Kids loved the idea of a magical friend who could make problems vanish. But adults watching might have wondered why such heavy themes were tucked into a talking horse show. Today, Luno the White Stallion is remembered as an oddball outlier in the Terry Toons catalog. Not bad, not great, just strange, and definitely unforgettable. Roger Ramjet, 1965 to 1969. Every era has its parody of superheroes, but few were as deliberately ridiculous as Roger Ramjet. Produced in the mid-60s, this cartoon turned the square-jawed hero archetype into a complete buffoon. Roger Ramjet is supposed to be America's greatest hero, but the more you watch, the more you realize he's also America's clumsiest. Roger's power comes from proton energy pills that give him temporary super strength. Sounds impressive until you see what he does with it. Instead of battling villains with skill, he bumbles through fights, creating more problems than he solves. His enemies, with names as absurd as Noodles Romanoff, often outsmart him with ease. Each episode was only 5 minutes long, but packed with manic energy. The animation was crude, the pacing breakneck, and the humor relentless. Roger would barrel through situations at lightning speed, leaving a trail of nonsense behind. The tone was tongue-in-cheek, poking fun at the self-serious superhero craze that dominated comics and television. What makes Roger Ramjet strange is that it embraced being bad on purpose. It wasn't trying to be polished. It was trying to be chaotic. Kids loved the fast pace and silly antics. Adults caught the satire, recognizing that this was a jab at the over-the-top patriotism of superhero icons. Decades later, Roger Ramjet still stands as one of the weirdest takes on the superhero genre. It's the cartoon equivalent of a wink and a shrug, reminding viewers that not all heroes wear capes with dignity. Some wear them while tripping over their own feet. Fearless Fly, 1965 to 66. Superheroes come in all shapes and sizes, but in the mid-60s, they also came as a fly. Fearless Fly, a segment spun off from the Milton the Monster Show, took the tiniest insect and turned him into a cape-wearing crusader. The catch: he only had powers when he wore his special red sweater and, most importantly, his oversized glasses. Meet Hiram, an ordinary housefly. When danger struck, he'd dart into a matchbox, slip on his sweater, and put on those giant glasses. Suddenly, he became Fearless Fly, faster than a rocket and stronger than a locomotive. Sounds impressive, until his glasses fell off, which happened almost every episode. Once that happened, he'd crash into walls, stumble into traps, or get swatted around like a fly. The villains matched the absurdity. His main foe was Dr. Goofy, a centuries-old mad scientist with a laughable name and a taste for wild schemes. The animation was limited, the jokes were corny, and yet kids tuned in week after week. Why? Because it was so strange. A superhero who literally couldn't see without glasses was something both relatable and ridiculous. Looking back, Fearless Fly stands as one of the oddest superhero cartoons ever produced. It wasn't slick, it wasn't serious, and it certainly wasn't inspiring. But it stuck in people's memories precisely because it was so offbeat. A tiny insect with eyewear issues somehow became a cult hero, proving once again that Golden Age cartoons never followed the rulebook. The Mighty Hercules, 1963 to 66. Take one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology and drop him into the world of low-budget Saturday morning TV, and you get The Mighty Hercules. This syndicated cartoon transformed the legendary strongman into a ring-powered superhero who shouted Olympia to activate his strength. The concept sounds epic, but the execution was anything but. Instead of battling gods and titans, Hercules spent most of his time foiling cartoon villains who looked like they wandered in from a comic strip. His companions included Newton, a centaur who constantly repeated himself, and Helena, who existed mostly to get captured. With stiff animation and recycled backgrounds, the show often looked like a slideshow rather than moving pictures. What made it even stranger was the way it blended ancient myth with modern tropes. Hercules might fight a wizard one moment and then stop a bank robber the next. The tone swung wildly between fantasy epic and Saturday morning silliness. And then there was the theme song, an overly dramatic ballad about Hercules' courage that became more famous than the show itself. For kids of the 60s, it was still entertaining. For adults watching today, it's baffling. The Mighty Hercules was a reminder that not every Golden Age cartoon aimed for polish or logic. Sometimes, it was enough to throw a hero on screen, give him a magic ring, and hope kids wouldn't notice how weird it all was. Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse, 1960 to 62. When Batman's creator decides to parody his own creation, you know things are going to get strange. Bob Kane, the man behind Gotham's Dark Knight, also brought the world Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse. And while Batman struck fear into criminals, this duo made you laugh at how ridiculous crime fighting could be. The premise was simple. Courageous Cat, a caped feline hero, and his sidekick Minute Mouse protected Empire City from a rogues gallery of bizarre villains. Their main nemesis was Flat-Face Frog, a gangster-style villain with a voice like an old movie crook. Already strange, but then came the gadgets. Courageous Cat's weapon of choice was a cat gun that could fire literally anything: ropes, nets, cannonballs, even a ray that made things vanish. Episodes zipped by at only 5 minutes each, cramming in action and puns at lightning speed. The animation was cheap and clunky, but the absurdity was the selling point. Kane wasn't trying to make another brooding hero. He was poking fun at the very idea of superheroes by making his cat hero as over-equipped and over-the-top as possible. Looking back, Courageous Cat and Minute Mouse is both a parody and an unintentional satire. It's clumsy, colorful, and endlessly silly. And in its own way, it proves even the creator of Batman couldn't resist laughing at the very genre he helped invent. Birdman and the Galaxy Trio, 1967 to 69. If you ever wanted a superhero who took himself way too seriously while still being hilariously odd, Birdman and the Galaxy Trio fits the bill. Produced by Hanna-Barbera, it introduced Birdman, a hero who drew his power from the sun. He could shoot solar blasts, fly, and fight evil, unless he was in the dark, at which point he collapsed like a drained battery. Birdman wasn't alone. The show also featured the Galaxy Trio, Meteor Man, who could grow massive, Gravity Girl, who manipulated gravity, and Vapor Man, who could turn into gas. On paper, it sounded like an all-star lineup. On screen, it came across as a mashup of overpowered characters battling underwhelming villains like Dr. Millennium and the Ant-Ape. The tone was deadly serious. Narration boomed. Battles were described with grave importance. And yet the animation showed stiff characters trading blasts until someone fell over. Often, conflicts ended almost instantly because the heroes were so powerful. Instead of excitement, you got anticlimax. Still, the show carved out a legacy. Birdman became a cult figure, later revived in parody form as Harvey Birdman, attorney at law. The Galaxy Trio, meanwhile, remain fondly remembered as some of the strangest space heroes of their time. Looking back, the cartoon feels like a time capsule of when studios thought kids wanted pure seriousness, even if the result looked more silly than epic. Space Angel, 1962-64. If Clutch Cargo wasn't creepy enough, along came Space Angel. Also produced by Cambria Studios, it used the same infamous Synchrovox technique, static drawings with real human mouths, awkwardly superimposed. The result was another series that looked less like an adventure cartoon and more like something out of a surreal nightmare. The show followed Scott McCloud, the titular Space Angel, as he defended the galaxy from villains and space threats. He piloted a sleek spaceship called the Starduster, aided by his crew of cosmic allies. The stories wanted to be pulp science fiction in the vein of Flash Gordon. But no matter how grand the plots were, viewers couldn't stop staring at the bizarre talking lips. What makes Space Angel different from Clutch Cargo is that the creators aimed for more serious storytelling. Episodes leaned into espionage, interstellar battles, and political intrigue. But paired with those unnerving visuals, the drama never landed the way it should have. Instead, every conversation looked and felt absurd. Audiences of the time watched because it was novel, but critics were unimpressed. Today, it lives on as one of the most unintentionally creepy cartoons ever produced. Proof that the golden age of animation was filled not only with classics, but also with experiments that went way off the rails. Golden Age cartoons weren't just cheerful animals and polished fairy tales. They were experiments, sometimes brilliant, sometimes baffling, and often unforgettable. From heroic flies in sweaters to horses that solved heartbreak, these shorts remind us that animation has always been a playground for the bizarre. Which of these strange gems surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that like button, and subscribe for more journeys into the weird side of animation history.